Hey, everybody, welcome to That Expert Show, where you help run the show. I'm Anna Canzano, and tonight we're talking about children on the spectrum, understanding how best to support them and understand them. I'm really interested in this topic because I frankly don't know that I have a great definition of autism or what it even means to be on the spectrum. And I think a lot of us don't. Like, we've heard these terms kind of thrown about. Maybe we know somebody in our kids' class, maybe we've come across, somebody who was on the spectrum. But I think that we can learn a lot about how best to support kids who are on the spectrum and their families. Our guest tonight is joining us all the way from Austin, Texas. She is the Chief Clinical Officer for Action Behavior Centers. Dr. Charna Mintz is our expert tonight. Dr. Mintz, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd love to begin by just talking with you about autism. What is it, and what does it actually mean when we talk about a child who is on the spectrum?
Yeah, as I think about this, if you were to Google what is autism, you're going to get 50, 60 different answers. So I think I'm going to give you my explanation, particularly when I'm talking to families that are first receiving a diagnosis of ASD. So to start with, it's complex. So there isn't anything simple about understanding autism, and it is a developmental condition or a developmental disability. And there are three things that are common across individuals with ASD, although it's a spectrum because each person that you meet will probably present a little bit differently. Those three commonalities, the first one is that there's going to be persistent challenges in social communication. Next, you're likely going to see some restricted interests. And then finally, the likelihood of repetitive behavior. And those can manifest themselves in a lot of different ways. So I'll just use the social communication difficulty as an example. A child with ASD might have very limited communication skills. They might not be able to speak any vocal words. They might not be able to use pictures to communicate. And we would refer to that as that persistent communication concern. But then you might also have somebody that has all the words and can speak at a very high level, but may not understand complex or abstract language. So if you said to them it's raining cats and dogs, they may look for cats and dogs because that language doesn't match what they're actually seeing in the real world.
That is fascinating. I like that example that you offer. For those of you who happen to be joining us live, I do want to invite you, if you have questions about autism, about children on the spectrum, how to understand it better, how to help them, feel free to post right now in the comment section. I'm monitoring that. Would love to be able to share your question with Dr. Mintz and have her answer it for you directly. I'm curious, how early does autism or does ASD present usually when it comes to children?
Yeah, so the common answer to that question is 2 years, but children can start to receive diagnoses as early as 18 months. And if there is a sibling in the family, that diagnosis might come even sooner than 18 months. But 2 years is a safe age.
And how does it normally manifest itself? What are the things that parents should watch for or that parents might take notice of before, say, a pediatrician does?
Yeah, so there's a couple developmental milestones. The first one is not reciprocally smiling by about 6 months of age. So most of us know what that looks like. We look down at a baby and we smile, and we anticipate that we're going to see that sort of modeled smiling response back. If that's not happening by about 6 months, that might be an indication that there is ASD. I'm not saying that if that happens, there definitively is. This is just one of the things that we suggest that families look for. In addition, no babbling or pointing or functional gestures by 12 months of age. So if a child wants a cup that's up, a sippy cup that's up on the counter, a functional point would be to look at the sippy cup and point their finger up at that. If you're not seeing those types of responses, you're not hearing babbling spelling or sounds by 12 months. And then finally, not having single word communication by 16 months.
Okay, so these are very definitive kind of milestone timelines that, you can be watching for. Obviously, each child is different, but in a general sense, that's what the science has shown, that the early signs would point to that. Are there actual known causes of ASD?
Yeah, so it's my job to always communicate that understanding the causes of ASD isn't in my scope. I focus on the intervention side. However, I think there's a common understanding that there is a genetic component to ASD as well as some potential environmental factors.
But when you're talking about environmental factors, can you delineate between that and, the things that I think I've heard in the past, the controversial notion that vaccines actually lead to or cause autism?
Yeah, so that study that got published many years ago, communicating that there was at least a very tight correlation, if not causation, between vaccines and ASD, has been debunked not once, but many times over. So at this point, there is not scientific evidence to indicate that vaccines would be the cause of ASD.
Can I check with you then when you say environmental factors, what do you mean by environmental factors?
For me, I don't have any clear information that I would feel comfortable stating. It's the statements that you will read are that ASD is impacted by genetic and environmental variables.
Got it. So obviously there's still more research to be done, to pin that down. When you talk about kids who are on the spectrum as they get older beyond, those early developmental years, what are the challenges for kids who are on the spectrum? And I guess secondarily, how can we as adults support them?
Oh, it's a big question. Maybe we'll just start with what some of the difficulties are that children might face. Obviously, communication is a really big one. So, if a child doesn't have a functional means of communicating their basic wants and needs, we can anticipate that it would be hard for them to function in a school setting with peers. But the same can be true for children that don't understand abstract language or, the way in which teachers might explain or over-explain or use a lot of information might be difficult for them as well. We see commonalities around resistance to change when schedules or patterns in that child's life get disrupted unexpectedly. And again, this isn't for all children with ASD. I want to be clear that the saying is true. You meet one child with ASD and you meet one child with ASD, but there are some common things that we see.
Mm-hmm.
And then so if you imagine a child is in a classroom and there is a fire drill, which is out of the ordinary and unanticipated, that might then result in some difficulties in coping, and that might look a lot of different ways. The child might be repeating what the schedule should be and asking for the teacher to put the schedule back to the way it should be instead of going out for a fire drill. They might become, if there's not communication or vocal communication, they might become upset or agitated. And that might take on the form of put in quotations, acting out behavior. So throwing something, pushing something as they adjust to that change in or unanticipated change in their schedule. Making friends is really difficult. One, if you don't have the same communication skills as your peers, that makes it difficult. In addition, that wanting to focus on very similar or highly preferred topics when that happens. So if I love dinosaurs and what I want to talk about is dinosaurs, and my friends like dinosaurs, but they also like trains and talking about Hawaii and, baking cookies, but I just want to talk about dinosaurs, friendships can sometimes become a little bit more difficult because there's not as many shared or common interests.
Yeah, I can see how that would be the case. It's interesting because when you talk about the difference now in, schools and how kids who are on the spectrum are incorporated more into the community rather than, sectioned off into a corner of the school and you rarely saw them. I think it presents the opportunity for kids to interact with kids much more on the spectrum, and I think that's healthier for everybody involved. I wonder sometimes what you see when it comes to the adults who are around the kids, whether it's the educators, the actual teacher in the classroom, or maybe it's a music teacher or a PE teacher. How much training do you think educators receive when they're having kids who are on the spectrum in their classrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is almost always not enough. If you consider that there are people that spend their whole careers learning and understanding individuals with ASD and how best to support them reach the goals and objectives that they want to reach and or their family wants to reach. And then you're asking, we'll start with a general educator to have enough information to know how to navigate the best ways to support that child in the classroom. There are some school districts in some states where there are people on staff, just like there are SLPs, speech and language pathologists, and occupational therapists. There are also behavior analysts who have the necessary expertise, or autism specialists. And I think in those districts, they're more prepared to understand the challenges that they face and to help support that child be the most successful learner that they can. And then in some districts, I think it's fly by the seat. And I will say, having been a teacher, it's fly by the seat of your pants. Like, you will learn how to get through the school year, and there might be a lot of successes, and there might also be a lot of frustration for the child, for the teacher, for the parent, and maybe for the other children in the classroom. So I'm just going to say not enough.
Yeah.
I would love for there to be more.
Right. I mean, not all school districts are blessed with those kind of resources, that are specially tailored to help these kids be good learners. So then in general, what advice or strategies can you offer adults, maybe, for those of us who aren't educators and we would just encounter kids who are on the spectrum in a different social setting, at a birthday party or at a soccer game or some other kind of, social gathering? What can you advise to grown-ups when you are encountering a kid who you surmise or it's clear that they are on the spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, it's I will answer that from my perspective because I love children, all children. So if I were to come across a child that I didn't quite understand the way in which they were behaving, I would probably do a little bit more watching and learning and understanding that difference doesn't mean wrong and doesn't mean bad. It just is a difference. And I would immediately advise the adult to start looking for ways in which you can interact with that child in a positive way and model that for the children. Although children are way better at this than adults are. I will tell you that, having been in schools for many years, adults spend a lot of time figuring out how to help all kids understand these differences. And then when you watch them engage, there's almost always children in the classroom that just inherently know what that child with ASD needs and benefits from. Sometimes they want to help too much, and you need to make sure that there's some independence. It's really the grown-ups that I think have been conditioned to be more cautious and more nervous. But all children, they're all children, right? They're all children, all need and want to be loved unconditionally. And I say watch, learn, see what they're drawn to, and then attempt to engage, or in our field we refer to it as pair yourself with the things that interests that child, so they see you as a friend, not as a foe or something that is aversive in their environment.
That's great advice. And I think, the circumstance that people probably come across is like the kid in the grocery store who's flopped down on the ground because they're upset. Maybe something didn't happen the way they thought it was going to. Maybe there was a change to the routine. Maybe they had in their head a preconceived notion of what was going to be happening at the grocery store and it didn't happen the way they expected. And so as an adult, you see sort of the result of that And it's easy, I think, for adults to look at that scene and go, oh, look at that child having a tantrum, instead of stepping back and thinking, oh, maybe that kid's on the spectrum. Maybe there's a lot more going on in the brain with that kid than at first glance that you would know.
Yeah, for those of us that help support families in our career, there are services that are now provided through medical insurance that involve family guidance. I think every one of us has met at least one parent that has that exact same story. That they were at a grocery store, they were at Target, they were at a toy store, they were at a gas station, they were in a restaurant, and something didn't go well. There was a change. The child wanted something that the parent needed to say no to. The child was looking for something that didn't exist. Maybe their shirt just felt uncomfortable, and the aftermath of that is the child on the floor. And the first thing that I would say is have compassion, because there is not a parent in the world nor a child in the world that's a preferred state of being, right? So if you come across that, you turn down the aisle in Target and you see a parent that's struggling, a smile goes a long way, rather than a judgmental statement of, you need to spank your child, you need to discipline your child. That's what happens when you give them everything they want. And families have experienced that over and over again. I once gave this advice to families, and nowadays it makes me sad that I ever had to give this advice, but to print business cards that literally said, my child has ASD, we're having a rough time. Thank you for your compassion, so that when people were walking by and staring, rather than the parent or the mom internalizing that and then struggling to help her child because it was such a difficult situation, handing that out gave the parent something to do that felt functional at the time to them.
Yeah.
But if we all just approach those situations with compassion in the first place, we wouldn't need those cards.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think you're bringing up the kinds of statements that people make, because this is probably what the families that you're working with have relayed to you over many years. I wonder, what can we teach our kids, our neurotypical kids, on how to best help and support their classmates who are on the spectrum in the classroom or on the playground?
Yeah, so I love this question, because 10 years ago, the question would have been, what do we need to teach the child with ASD to cope in the classroom or cope on the playground? And what I love about the question is it's really bi-directional. Like, we're focusing on the benefits of neurotypical children understanding really diversity, right? That's what we're talking about. I will share a resource that I've utilized over the years. It's the acronym for it is OR, which stands for the Organization for Autism Research, and they have a tool called Kits for Kids. And so if you are a classroom teacher or you are a parent that is looking for something that might help educate a classroom full of children about your child, there's a really nice story that goes with it that talks about the differences. It brings up common things that the other children in the classroom might see, and ways in which to maybe engage with the child with ASD. And then families and teachers can use that to help guide, now, how do we individualize that? Because no child coming into a classroom with ASD is going to present exactly the same way as that book or that social story. And again, I focus it almost always on strengths. So what is special about the child with ASD? What is special about all the other children in the classroom? And learning about differences and strengths, as opposed to, this child might yell, this child might be aggressive, but instead help focus interests around what that child might be extraordinarily good at. Organizing papers, right?
Yeah.
Knowing the rules of the classroom, talking about dinosaurs and knowing everything there is about dinosaurs. And again, I'll just keep saying, children will surprise you. When we as adults take a step back and watch kids just be in their natural environment. I'm not saying that's always the answer, but they will surprise you. They tend to do better than we do.
You know, it's funny. One of the greatest joys that I have right now is we have a kindergartner who has a little boy in the class that has a cochlear implant. So he's hearing impaired. And, you know, she finds a way to communicate with him. She considers him one of her best friends, and I say, well, how do you communicate with him? And she just says, well, I just hold my heart up so that he knows that I'm thinking about him. And, he, I guess, uses the pad to communicate with her and writes her name out on the pad and then presses it over and over again to let her know that he's thinking about her. And it's such a precious exchange, and that's different. He's not on the spectrum that I know of, but it's a great example of what you're saying, where kids will just find a way. While we're talking about schools, what are some options for schools to help kids that are on the spectrum? I know that some time ago, the station I worked for, we did a lot of reporting on seclusion rooms, and there were some really controversial seclusion rooms. Are there quiet spaces that the school should create for kids who are, having a moment that they can go there and quiet down? Or, what is the modern thought on these type of spaces?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying these are my opinions, and they, come from many years of work, but they're not necessarily the only answers to the questions. I would start by saying every child is going to need some individualized intervention or support or modification. So I usually don't look for there should be a space in the school for children with ASD to go to, because that creates separation and not a sense of belonging or community. And I'd rather encourage that teacher, and with the support of the parents and the rest of the individualized education plan team, should there be an IEP, create a comfortable classroom for all the learners in that environment. So if the child with ASD doesn't always learn best sitting in a chair, and might learn best if you replace that chair with a beanbag, and they will stay focused and attending and responding at higher rates, then I would make sure there was access to beanbags in that classroom for all children, right? Not just for the child with ASD. If when that child becomes agitated or upset, is learning to ask for a break, and when that child takes a break, prefers to sit and look at a book, then I would make sure there was a reading corner that was comfortable. So when the child said, hey, I need a break, they have a place to go, but within their classroom. So rather than making separate environments, anything we can do to help our children, help children with ASD have access to their peers and neurotypical learning environments, assuming that's what the family and the IE team wants, the better.
Oh, that's interesting. I think some of the conversations that I've had with parents, though, where the tension comes into play is when kids who are on the spectrum wind up getting violent because something hasn't gone right, obviously, and there is kicking or biting or spitting or hitting or chair throwing. And so I think sometimes parents of neurotypical kids then fall into this zone where they're like, well, wait a minute, I'm all about inclusion, but I don't want my kid to get hurt because, they're the unwitting victim of a thrown chair. How do you deal best with that kind of situation and that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, so I'm going to way overgeneralize right now, because if I were presented with a child who engaged in, let's just say, aggression or in the form of chair throwing at other people, my very first step, long before I was figuring out how to manage when that happens in the general education classroom, is determine why. What are the triggers? Under what conditions are those behaviors likely to occur? And then I would seek to support that child with their peers during times that is least likely to occur. So we don't want to take a child that isn't prepared or ready to learn in an environment in a safe way with their peers and just say, good luck, right? But there has to be a lot of thought and planning around what that integration or what that inclusion will look like over time. If there is a child that engages in that behavior, but at a very low rate, and so something can trigger it, but it happens once a year and we don't know what that's going to be, then that child and that teacher and the IEP team should have a crisis plan. So should those behaviors happen, this is what we're going to do to keep everybody safe. In the same way that there are crisis plans for all other types of things that could happen in the classroom, like a child with a seizure disorder. If a child were to have a seizure, everyone knows what to do and how best to manage that. But there always is a why for some of those behaviors that I think are scary to individuals that don't understand ASD. And understanding the why, interpreting the why, and then intervening on the why, I think can help dissipate and bring the risk to everybody down.
That's interesting. I know that, you know, some schools take to letting the child who is having the outburst simmer down in the classroom and actually removing everybody else from the classroom. So they just kind of a flexible learning schedule for the day when something like that happens.
Yeah, I have seen that used. I have recommended that be used under some situations many years ago. What that tells me is there's probably some more upfront work to do to help support that child in that learning environment. There's something going on in that environment that is not creating the best possible opportunity for effective learning to happen. That's where I would focus. Now, that doesn't mean you don't need a crisis plan or a reactive plan should it happen while you're trying to solve for that. But maybe we didn't fully understand the child and what that child needs to be successful.
Interesting. Can we talk a little bit about, and it looks like we do have some questions coming in. One question from someone watching live is that it seems like there are more children with autism today. Why? First of all, is that true that there are more children with autism today, or are we simply identifying it more?
Yeah, so I looked up some statistics. I've been doing this for a really long time, and I hate to say that you lose track of what the previous statistics were, but I thought we'd all be interested in looking at them. In 2004, the prevalence of ASD was 1 in 125. And most recently in 2020, we were given a prevalence of 1 in 54 by the CDC. So like just taking a pause to understand that in 16 short years, we are seeing that prevalence increase dramatically. There were some studies that were done around diagnostic rate over time and whether that could be the sole contributor to why we're seeing more children being diagnosed with ASD. And the answer is that can't account for all of those increases. And so I think if we go back to the why and the general statement that, you know, given my scope, I can just state this back, that it is a combination of genetic and environmental variables that are not necessarily understood, which means that finding a way to treat early or are there things that can be done to be preventable? And then, you know, there are folks that say, why would you even want to do that, right? Autism is beautiful. And if it's 1 in 54 and 1 in 125, individuals with autism bring beautiful strengths to the world, and that's okay too. But I don't know the why it's increasing. But it isn't just because there is an increase in diagnosis.
That's interesting. So along those lines, then, can we talk a little bit about boundary setting? And, you know, with a neurotypical kid, boundary setting is vital. I mean, it's like the kids are actually craving boundaries and they're not happy if they have no boundaries, counterintuitively. With neurotypical kids, reward systems generally work. Positive reinforcement works better in most cases than negative reinforcement. Does that change when you're dealing with or trying to support a child who is on the spectrum?
So my training is in behavioral science, where we spend a lot of time talking about reinforcement and punishment and the effectiveness of those interventions. And I would say that all organisms respond to positive reinforcement in a highly effective way. So whether you have ASD or you don't, my recommendation would always be to err on the side of sort of teaching when good things happen. When you do good things happen. When you make good choices, good things happen. Teaching that relationship is never going to fail you. I think the place where sometimes folks struggle is understanding what serves as the reinforcer, right? So when you use that strategy, it has to be based on what the child wants or what the child prefers, not what the adult wishes to give. So I have worked with a family previously where the child really preferred a specific computer game, but the dad didn't like that computer game, didn't want the child playing it. It was aversive to the dad. So the dad wanted to give the child a different computer game for, we'll just put in quotations, having a good day at school. Well, it didn't work. And it didn't work because what was being offered to the child for having a good day at school wasn't something that the child found reinforcing. And so I think it brings us back full circle to truly understanding the individual that you're trying to support and making sure that if you're going to use reinforcement, it's tied to something that child holds valuable.
That's interesting.
And that's not different for us, right? Like,
yeah.
I use my husband in examples all the time when I'm working with groups of parents. And if he washes the car and I give him flowers for washing the car, there's not a good chance he's going to wash that car in the future because he's like, why did you just waste money on these flowers?
Right.
But if he washes the car and I bring him a pizza, hot, steaming, ready for him when he's done washing the car, there's a chance in the future he might wash that car if he knows there's going to be a pizza waiting. So the same thing. These are not specific to children with ASD. We can see how they work in our lives as well. It just might be a more deliberate use if you're trying to help the child learn something new.
Can you go a little bit more too into the boundary setting aspect where it's like with a neurotypical kid, you can tell them, okay, you got to stop doing that. If you do that again, then this privilege will be taken away. That's pretty common parenting to do that. It's not ideal, obviously, but, with kids who are on the spectrum, does boundary setting actually work? And if you don't set boundaries, are you creating more issues down the line?
Yeah, I think of boundaries as the rules of the house or the rules of the classroom or the rules of the amusement park. Like wherever you go, there's a set of expectations.
Yeah.
And I think it's appropriate, assuming that the child that you're talking about can understand what those rules are. So that's the first thing. If we're expecting a child to understand rules, they're not ready developmentally yet to understand the no of those boundaries, or you can throw them out the window. It won't matter.
Right.
But I think that teaching to rules and expectations is completely appropriate. I would go about it in a slightly different way. So I would, if the rules are followed or the boundaries are followed or the way of being in that environment is followed, then there's something good at the end of it. So it's sort of like do the thing you don't really love to get the thing that you really love, as opposed to if you don't engage in the way you need to, you lose something. I think the world is a lot more joyous when we focus on building up instead of, and I know when you're telling someone you're going to take something from them, you also can get into this mode of, okay, take it, take more. Like so what? I don't care.
Right.
And then it becomes a battle of wills.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I don't have the patience or the energy for those battles of wills. So I would rather just focus on, we're going to do this. You might not love it, but as soon as we're done doing that, you're going to get to do something that you really do love and will appreciate.
That's great. I wanted to close with a question that came from someone on Twitter who says, if a unique characteristic of ASD is impairment in social, why don't we remediate this core characteristic with quality inclusion? Why do we educate kids in self-contained environments without access to typically developing children who can support the social world of those with ASD?
I mean, I don't know who wrote that, but it's my kindred spirit. I agree. I agree that all children with ASD should be educated in an environment that includes their peers. I think the answer is because it's hard and schools are under-resourced and under-supported. And as we described earlier, if a child is included in a classroom, but that classroom has not been properly prepared to welcome and invite that child in, that could potentially lead to adverse effects, like the child engaging in behavior that they don't want to engage in, but could cause problems for the classroom as a whole. And so I think we should do it for everybody, but we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that gives that child their best opportunity to learn, as well as all of the children around them. And that takes resources.
And that is always the challenge. Well, thanks so much for your information. Thank you for the resource that you'll provide. We will include that in the tip sheet that we put together at the end of the episode, and we'll be sure to post that. But thanks for your good work in this field and your hopeful attitude toward, how we can make this world a more inclusive place for all kids.
I would just say we should remember their children. And if you have a passion and a love for humans and for children, that's our starting point of looking at everybody.
Love it.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I had a great time.
Thank you so much. Oh man, great information from the doctor there. As I mentioned, we'll be putting together a tip sheet that summarizes her key points. Would love to hear your feedback on the show. You can share this as well. We'll have it on YouTube and on our website, thatexpertshow.com. We put these shows out as podcasts as well, so wherever it is that you listen to your podcast, whether it's on Apple or Google Podcasts, you can find it there. And I would love to hear from you. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just look for Anna Canzano. I want your ideas on who I should interview next and the topics that I should cover next. This is really a dialogue. It's That Expert Show. I'm not the expert, the guests are, and I love to be able to bring your questions to them. We are on Monday nights at 7 o'clock Pacific time. Thanks so much for being part of That Expert Show, and it's where you help run the show.